this could be one of the most important conversations that I have because so many women, and especially women in front-facing careers, deal with so many things. And when I was emailing you, I had like a full list and I'm like, oh my gosh, she is going to think that I am psychotic. But I swear I'm not the only one that goes through some of these things. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no, it's an honor to be here. And I don't think you're psychotic at all. I think you're very normal because unfortunately, this is normal right now. That's the bad news. But the good news is, even with how, if I could say, I'm not supposed to use this word, but I'm going to use it, how crazy everything is, there are things that we can do. So that's the good news.
So before we get into all of that, can you talk to me a little bit about your journey and how you got into this field and what made you want to help others, especially those in these public-facing jobs?
Yeah. So I started my career as a physical therapist. And I loved being a physical therapist, helping people get out of pain, be able to go back to their work and go back to their sports. And I realized just how much psychology is in physical rehabilitation, really our bodies. I had a particular gentleman I was working with. He had a surgical amputation on his leg, and he came down to the physical therapy gym and wanted nothing to do with me. He yelled at me. He wanted to go back to his room. We sent him back to his room, and then we did rounds later, talking with the doctors and nurses and therapists. Everyone agreed that this gentleman was struggling. That made sense. But what happened next is literally what changed my life. The attending physician, the surgeon who had just cut off the man's leg the day before, said, I'll prescribe him Prozac. And I thought, there's a time and place for medication, absolutely. But I was thinking, I feel like maybe we need to talk to him. We need to help him deal with this new phase of his life. And it was right then and there. It was almost like the heavens opened up and said, this is your calling, Elizabeth. So I went back to school for psychology, got my degree in psychology. And as I was in psych school, I just realized, I was thinking, why do I have to get a PhD to learn this? Understanding how our mind works and how to make it work for instead of against us is something that every single individual would benefit from. And so when I got my degree, that really became my passion.
And were you anxious at all as a child? Did you have any of the symptoms that led you to wanting to help others in this way?
So I was a worrier. Like, give me a topic and I will worry about it. And I remember talking to a classmate. It was probably my second year in psychology school, and she had generalized anxiety disorder, so she was a worrier. And I remember telling her, you don't have to worry all the time. There are things that you can do. And have you ever given advice to someone and realized that you also needed that advice?
Yes.
So that was kind of where I was. I was like, oh, wait a minute. And so I started a process that I didn't know what it was at the time, but really what I did was I rewired my brain. So I no longer worry about things. I mean, I worry about some things, but I'm not a worrier anymore. And I really was able to rewire my brain before I even knew what I was doing. And so that's really the power of this. When we learn these skills, we can rewire our brains in any ways. We rewire our brains consistently when we learn something new, whether it's a skill or new knowledge, we're rewiring our brain. So why don't we do that in a very purposeful way so that it helps us?
You've helped clients from celebrities to athletes to Fortune 500 companies. And I want to know, are there any similarities or commonalities you see in people in these specific types of jobs when they come to you?
They are way more similar than not. Yeah, definitely. Everyone, everyone who isn't a narcissist, everyone has an inner critic. That voice, whether it sounds like imposter syndrome, whether it sounds like a perfectionist, whether it sounds like judging themselves, shitting all over themselves, and understanding that the higher on the distress scale we are, the more likely that negative conversation is to have in our mind. And so understanding that even people who you think have it all, they're human too. And they need their support. They need these skills that we're talking about too. So understanding that regardless of what you're doing, people are way more similar than different.
Well, when I was at my last station, I never considered myself an anxious person. But at my last station, I started out of nowhere having panic attacks or anxiety attacks. I would get so out of breath when I went on air. And I originally was like, I must be sick. So I went to the doctor and I said, what's wrong with me? And frankly, I wanted them to find something that was actually wrong with me so that I could be like, this is what it is, diagnose it. And I came back with healthy, nothing wrong, but you could be a little stressed. You could have anxiety. And once I put a label on it, it made it 10 times worse because now I knew it was anxiety and it was in my head. And that wasn't a quick fix for me because now, well, how do I put a Band-Aid on it? It's literally my brain saying I'm in fight or flight. So every single time I would get on air, I had 4 months left of my contract. Every time I would get on air, I would get in my head and I would start the clock of, okay, I'm going to be out of breath soon. Okay. And with weather, I was anchoring the weather. You talk for 3 to 4 minutes straight sometimes. So around the minute and a half mark, I would start getting really out of breath and saying, oh my goodness, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And by the end of it, I was winded. I could barely get words out. And what was the worst part about it is that now every time I stepped into that newsroom, went on camera, the lights went on, the same thing would pop into my head every single time. And my first question is, how common are anxiety attacks or panic attacks in public-facing jobs? Because at that moment, I felt so ashamed and I felt so alone in that.
Yeah. Well, it's not uncommon. And if we could just take a step back and talk about anxiety and what I call just distress in general. So in psychology, there's a term distress. It's the negative aspect of stress. There's positive stress, right? If you're planning a vacation, it's kind of stressful, but it's exciting. Distress is the negative aspect of stress. Another way to think of it is any emotion you don't want. Anxiety, fear, worry, could be sadness, could be anger. All of that goes in the distress pile. And distress exists on a continuum. From 0, no distress at all, you just got off the massage table, someone hands you a warm blanket, to 10 out of 10, the most distressed we've been. And there's something I call the psychological red zone. The red zone happens when we're at a 7 out of 10 or higher. A 7, an 8, a 9, or a 10, that's the psychological red zone. And in the red zone, this is where the anxiety attacks happen. This is where the panic happens. But what else is happening on a biological basis is we go from out of the red zone using our frontal lobe, that rational thinking. I can handle this. I've done this many times before. I'm trained in this. I have hours upon hours of evidence to show how good I am. When we get in the red zone, it's no longer that frontal lobe functioning as well. Our limbic system, the fight or flight mechanism in our brain, hijacks our rational thinking. It's the same mechanism as if we were drowning. So if you were literally drowning, flailing around for help, and someone said, well, just calm down. You've done this before. It's not a big deal. Could you calm down? No. And so I explain that to you because that's exactly what happens when people have these anxiety or panic attacks. Their subconscious feels like it's drowning. It's the only thing you can think of. You can't not think about it. And as you think about it, what happens? You feel more anxious. As you feel more anxious, you think about it more. As you think about it more, it feels more anxious. And I call this, it's like a tornado that puts us in the red zone and keeps us there.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And so for some people, it's anxiety. For some people, it's depressed mood. For some people, it's anger. It can look different for different people. The mechanism is the same, and the way we address it is also very similar.
So are there any things that people can do to help with this? Because it's not something like, well, just take a few deep breaths. Well, I'm in the middle of talking on stage, and taking a couple deep breaths feels like not just a couple deep breaths. It feels, in news terms, it feels like an hour that there is silence there.
Yeah. So what's happening there, it sounds like, is this concept of classical conditioning. Maybe you have heard of Pavlov's dog. Remember Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov rang the bell. The dog would salivate because the food was coming. And so that subconscious learned bell equals food, so I salivate. For you, your subconscious learned it wasn't safe for you to be on camera, right? It puts you in that fight or flight. And so part of the intervention would have been, I don't know if you're still doing it.
I had to go into another capacity, which was digital reporting. And now I've started to actually freelance report and things, and I can do it again. But this has been 4 to 5 years now.
Wow, yeah. And so, addressing it before to desensitize yourself. And again, this is all automatic. It's all subconscious. It's nothing that you had control over, but we get to take control to help you change that. So with Pavlov, once he rang the bell but stopped giving the food, it's called extinction. It gets rid of that response. And that would have been helpful for something like what you were going through. When it's happening right then and there, the thing is, when you're going into the situation, you want to assess what's my number. Because if you get on air and your number increases 3 points, well, if you started at a 2, getting you up to 5 is not that big of a deal. If you started at a 7 and you go up to 10, that's a big deal. So doing things proactively during it would have been really taking those breaths. That's the easiest thing to do. We can talk about other ways to decrease that distress. But once you get out of that critical point, you go from limbic system back into your frontal lobe. We also need to change that conversation that you're having with yourself. It doesn't work when you're in the red zone. Again, your subconscious feels like it's drowning. If you're drowning, you can't think happy thoughts and not worry about drowning. It's impossible.
And I was also trying to avoid getting back on camera at any portion that I could. I would switch shifts. I would do that. And I think that was actually hurting it because I was trying to avoid rather than just take it head on and be like, this isn't scary. I know I can do this. And instead, it was a situational anxiety. Everything else in my life was fine. But the minute I would get into the newsroom prior to getting on camera, my heart would start to beat. I would say, okay, it's coming. And then that's when it would happen.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. When anyone avoids their fear, it increases their fear. Because what your subconscious learns is I'm only safe if I avoid it.
Yeah.
There's something called exposure therapy, which is not, flashing oneself, but it's exposing oneself to the fear. And just to make it simple, let's say someone has a fear of spiders. Thinking about a spider causes them anxiety. The best way to help them overcome that is to expose them to their fear progressively more. We call it systematic desensitization. Because what happens is anxiety goes up and it feels like it will go up and then your head will explode. But what happens is it goes up. Eventually, if you wait long enough, the anxiety plateaus and then it goes down. And you need to experience that plateau and going down for your subconscious to learn, okay, I don't have to be afraid of this. But when you expose yourself and then you leave, that anxiety just keeps going up and up and up.
So what are some things that people could do before they get on camera that could maybe help ease them a little bit when they get into that high pressure situation?
Yeah, so again, we want to take steps to do things that are healthy and helpful to make sure that number is as low as possible on the distress scale. That means if you had an argument with your partner or you're coming in from traffic and you're all riled up, you want to make sure you take some of those steps. What can you do? There are lots of things that we can do. Exercise, and I don't necessarily mean going to the gym. Sometimes if I have a client in my office, if they're at a 9 out of 10, we'll stand up and run as fast as they can in place for 45 seconds. Now that may feel like, what is that going to do? But what it does is it releases biochemicals in our brain to take us out of that critical red zone. So any kind of exercise. I have a personal trampoline, one of those little trampolines. Great thing to do. Jumping on that for 30 seconds, a minute will help decrease that distress. Skipping around, doing a minute of push-ups, sit-ups, squats. Again, it doesn't seem like it would make sense because if you're already feeling anxious, but it does because, it releases those biochemicals. Music can be really powerful, right? I'm sure you've heard a song that you haven't heard in years, and it brings you right back to that time. Music can have such a powerful impact on our emotions. I actually recommend my clients keep what I call a get out of the red zone playlist, right? Of songs that bring you back to a happier time. You like the lyrics. Using our breath. I have a dear friend who was a master Navy SEAL, 28 years, wow. Right? He would jump out of airplanes behind enemy lines and do whatever he needed to do to protect our country. It's life or death. And I asked him once, I said, how are you all not in this red zone? And he said, we use our breath. So if it works for Navy SEALs, it can work for us. And there are lots of ways. Most people have been breathing for a good portion of their life. So it's not about breathing, not breathing. It's about taking in deep inhales and then exhaling out. One thing I often recommend is bubbles. right? So if you were
Interesting.
going to use a bubbles, you'd take a deep breath in and then you'd exhale slowly. Now, not everyone has bubbles right there, but pretending you have that. That can be a mechanism. 4, 7, 8. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. All different ways, and you just kind of play with it. What works best for me? The other thing to consider is what are you putting in your mind? If you're not in the red zone, you can address that mind because that frontal lobe's still working. So if you're going in thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad, that's going to get you up. Now, also remember that our subconscious has what I would call a BS meter. So I'm going to be fine. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be great. Your subconscious may say, not so sure about that. So find a thought in between. I'm taking steps to make sure that I remain calm. I'm very proud of myself for how well I'm handling myself. Those kinds of things that aren't going to cause that BS meter to not believe you. Something else to consider is just our posture, right? That posture of standing tall, shoulders back, smile on your face, that actually tells our brain, I'm safe. So these are just different ways that people can be using these tools before they need it. And that way they come in at a lower level of distress.
Now, when I was deciding I need to take a break, I had 4 months to get through. I got through those 4 months and I said, okay, I'm not going to renew my contract. I'm just going to take a break, take a beat, and figure out what is next. I no longer had news. And when I no longer had news, I self-identified with being a newscaster, with being a news anchor so much. And I think public-facing people in particular can relate to this. You place so much of your identity on your career. And so when I didn't have that, it felt like grief. It was honestly one of the most depressing times for me because I said, well, if I'm not a newscaster, what am I? And I'm wondering, is that common, and what would be some advice for that?
Sure. Yeah, it's very common. I work with a lot of athletes who experience something similar when they're no longer, professional athletes who've been working their entire life, and then they get injured or it's time for them to retire. It
Right.
can be and it's not just identity. It's something called mattering. Mattering, very simply, is feeling like we add value to others and others add value to us. It is core to our psychological well-being to experience mattering. When people feel like they don't matter, anxiety and depression go way up. So what I would encourage, and what I do encourage when I'm working with clients who are going through this, is to say, how do you matter outside of that? And this calls into cultivating your relationships. It calls into how are you serving others. It calls into meeting your own needs. And it calls into really applying our values. Values, of course, are intrinsically positive characteristics. All values are positive, and yet each individual has values that are more important to them than others. And you can go through a whole values checklist. One easy way to do this is, we could just do a quick exercise now. Think of someone who you admire. And so the viewers can think of someone you admire. Once you have that person in your mind, think of 3 things that you admire in that person. Maybe their sense of service, their compassion, their sense of humor, whatever it is. Now, those 3 things that you admire in someone else are also 3 things that you admire in yourself. Those are 3 values that are very important to you, because what we admire in others, we admire in ourselves. So whatever person you chose, if someone else had chosen that same person, they might have 3 completely different characteristics that they admire in that person. So then in terms of mattering, the question is, how can you apply those characteristics in your life now, independent of what you're doing for your job?
That's such a good point, because when I stopped my contract, I honestly felt like a failure. I felt like I had let my profession down. I felt like I let my community down. I felt like there was nothing until I got my next job that would help me feel better and feel like I mattered, like you said.
Yeah, it's so powerful, and particularly with, all that's going on in this world right now. There's high red zone and there's low mattering. And when we address both of those, that's when significant changes are going to happen. And the beauty is, it doesn't take years of therapy. It doesn't take really any money to do this. It just requires us to start to change what's going on inside of us.
Now, I did become a digital reporter after this, and then I started to host a national streaming show and started to do that, and that kind of eased my way into it. And now I've been freelance reporting for Fox Los Angeles, so I've slowly gained up the confidence to be back on camera and doing that more so. But I want to talk
Which
about
can I just say one thing? Like, I applaud you so much for that. That took so much to do. And instead of saying, nope, can't do it, what you were doing without realizing it probably is you were exposing yourself, a step here and a step here and a step here. So I hope you're really proud of that.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
I think though, once you start climbing the ladder, you start going to bigger markets, you start getting these new positions, there's something called imposter syndrome,
Yeah,
which
yes.
not only I deal with, but a lot of women in our news industry have dealt with. Can you talk about imposter syndrome?
Yes. Imposter syndrome is that notion of they are going to figure out I have no idea what I'm doing, or they are going to finally realize I am in way over my head. And if anyone out there has ever experienced that, 70% of the population experiences imposter
Wow.
syndrome. And with all due respect, you only experience imposter syndrome when you're up high on that ladder, right? If you're nothing against people who open a door for someone, but if that is your job, you probably don't feel like an imposter. So realizing first that it's completely normal doesn't mean it feels good, but it's very normal. And also realizing what is happening in imposter syndrome is often people are comparing themselves to everyone above them, as opposed to looking behind and being like, oh, wait a minute, I've come a long way.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's so true. And also, not only imposter syndrome, but we're also facing a lot of rejection by news directors, by other people, by the community. And that can, target you as well as feeling like maybe I'm not good enough at this, like if that's what you're feeling.
Yeah, very much so. And here's the thing, a lot of times without realizing it, people tie their worth into the feedback. So it's not just maybe you're not right for our news station. It's what people may hear is you're not worthy. You are a failure, which may be that conversation that's happening sometimes in the head anyway. And so it's just data to support it. So we want to just be really aware. We all know that just because you read something on the internet doesn't mean it's real or it's true. Just because you hear something between your ears does not mean it is real or true. We have 60,000 thoughts every day. 60000 thoughts every single day. The majority of those thoughts are not factual. They are not true. And that's independent of our IQ. It's not about how smart we are. It's the way that our brain tries to process information. So again, this is that power of being able to rewire, to change that conversation, not just in a superficial affirmation. I believe in myself. That's lovely. A lot of times that doesn't work. But we can rewire our brain so that we start to think differently. We start to see ourselves differently, and that conversation changes.
Yeah, because we're told to have a thick skin in
Yeah.
this business, but we're also human beings. And so when we have internet trolls telling us how we look, what we should do differently, how we should speak differently, we say, well, it's just people on the internet. Who cares? But that can be easier said than done.
Completely. Yeah. And so part of that is, be careful what you read, because what we put into our minds, isn't always helpful. Also realize when we receive feedback from others and it hurts our feelings, it's because it's our own fear too. So I'm going to illustrate that. Let me give an unrelated example. Think of something that you are 100% confident in. 100% confident in. Do you have something you're 100% confident in? And it's okay if not, because usually when I'm speaking to a group of women, everyone's like, nope. Okay, so I'm going to give one. How confident are you in your ability to walk?
Very confident.
Okay,
Thank
maybe
you.
not in 8-inch heels, right? Maybe not, I live in Chicago, maybe not in the snow, but in general, you got walking down.
Yes.
And so if someone said, you're not a very good walker, would that hurt your feelings? Okay, well, we're going to go down one. Breathing. How confident are you in your ability to breathe?
Very confident.
Okay, and if someone said, you're not a very good breather, would that hurt your feelings? Or would you be like, what are you talking
Yeah,
about?
I'd be like,
Yeah,
what?
because you already know it's not true. So realizing that when these people are saying these mean things, it only hurts if part of you buys into it. And I see
Ah,
this not as guilt or shame, but as empowerment, because people out there are going to say mean things. Why? Because they're in the red zone. Fight or flight. They are fighting. They're trying to feel better about themselves. They're trying to matter by putting you down. Not a healthy way to matter, but that's what they're trying. And when we use our rational brain, that frontal lobe, we can say, oh, poor dear, they just feel badly about themselves. But also realize, wait a minute, this is actually a trigger for me. This is my own fear. Let me address that, because then what people say really does not impact you as much.
wow, that's so true. Ugh. Also, in our industry, a lot of us are here for the passion. We're passionate about our jobs. We're not here for the paycheck necessarily. But how can women stay lit up by their purpose without feeling what we call the burnout?
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, the burnout is just living in that psychological red zone. Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot going on. How can you do that? Well, there are a couple things. One, take that time for yourself. Figure out what gives you that passion. And part of it hopefully is work, but how about outside of work? Is it connecting with friends? Is it going for a walk? Is it meditating? Whatever it is, prioritize that. Even if you can't do an hour and a half of yoga every day, but what can you do to make sure that you are at your best? And I'll give an unrelated example. My husband, we just had our 24th wedding anniversary yesterday. Um,
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, 11 years ago, he was diagnosed with ALS, which is prognosis is 3 to 5 years. The doctor at the Mayo Clinic literally told me 11 years, take him home to prepare to die.
Wow.
He's still alive, by the way. And so he was in the hospital maybe about 8 years ago for over 100 days. It would take me an hour and a half to get there each way. It was very stressful, to say the least. I know I need 3 things to be my passionate self. I need sleep, I need meditation, and I need exercise. That's just what I need. And even when I was dealing with all this and our kids were young and all that, I still took the time. It wasn't maybe a great workout, but at least I was walking around the block. It wasn't 20 minutes of meditation, but maybe I was taking 3 to 5 minutes to do some breathing. So looking at what do you need, and each person is unique. For some people, meditating puts them in the red zone, right? So what do you need, and then how can you implement it regardless of your schedule? That will help invigorate you so that when you come into work, you're not in that red zone. Because again, in the red zone, your subconscious feels like it's drowning. You cannot be enthusiastic about things. You're just trying to survive.
Yeah, and as somebody that is a caregiver like yourself, how has that shaped you in creating these tools to help other people?
Well, it gives me the opportunity to practice what I preach. I mean, right now he's on a ventilator, a feeding tube for 8 years, completely paralyzed. It's a lot. It's a lot. And, we get handed different things for whatever reason, but I think it's a really powerful message, because I'm not saying I'm never in the red zone. I am. But these tools work even for life or death situations like what we're dealing with.
When we talk about transitions, we talk about health issues or we talk about motherhood, these things can be life changing. I mean, I'm a somewhat new mom. She's going to be 3. So I had a child 3 years ago. And when I first became a mom, I was like, oh my gosh, I now have this baby to take care of while also still trying to excel at my career. Can we be fully present as a mother, but also fully present professionally? Can you give some
Yeah.
advice to that?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm a mom of 2. I have 2 daughters. So I definitely get that. Um, there's so much pressure to do it all. And I think one of the keys, well, there are a couple keys. One is, you're going to hear me say this over and over again because it's true. Do what you need to do to stay out of that red zone, because when we're in the red zone, that's when everything gets overwhelming. But second, realize that being present is what's so important. When you are at work, allow yourself to be work and engaged in that. And when you're home, allow yourself to be engaged in that. What happens a lot of times is we're with our kiddo, but we're thinking about work, or we're at work and we're worried about our kiddo. And
Yes.
that crossing of the boundaries mentally puts so much pressure on us that can cause a lot of that burnout. Also, as parents, I would suggest getting rid of one single word in your vocabulary. And when you do, your life will change. Coming up next. No, I'm just kidding. And that word is should. Do you
Hmm.
should all over yourself? I
Yes.
should be a better mom. I should work out more. I should look better. We should all over ourselves. And
I
when we
should
should,
clean the house a lot
yes,
more.
yeah, yeah, yeah. When we should all over ourselves, we feel guilt and shame.
Yeah.
And by the way, when we should all over others, we feel angry and resentful. So that
Yes.
one word causes all of this tension. Throw the word should away. And people often say, well, I should be a good mom. Just change the word should to would like. I would like to be a good mom. Oh, okay, that's empowering. That's what can I do now? That's that growth mindset. How can I be even better? But taking the judgment and that big finger wagging at you, which is what a should is, we don't need that.
Also, I am somebody that is super future focused. And I know that's not a good thing. I know we should stay in the present, but in our lines of careers, we tend to keep looking ahead and how we can keep growing. And I know in talking to so many podcasters and talking to so many women on this show, I've learned that it's a big zigzag and it's not just this straight staircase like a lot of people think. And I just want you to ask, how can people try to stay more in the present and not so in the future all the time? Because that's difficult for a lot of us.
It is difficult. And it's not that you don't ever want to think about the future, right? We want to have that too. But being mindful, being present is a skill. Just like learning how to golf, right? You learn how to golf and you practice golf and then you get better at golf. You can't not. Same thing with being mindful. So just taking some moments each day to be very present. And what could that be? Looking around and just seeing, what do you see? I'm in my office and I've spent hundreds of hours in here. But if I really looked around, I could see things I never noticed before because I haven't been that present. So looking around, what are you seeing? Taking those deep breaths, filling your heart with gratitude. So just being present and thinking, what is one thing that I feel grateful for? And then allow your heart to just fill with that gratitude. All of these are ways that you can enjoy the present while still working towards a future that you want.
Gosh, 1000%. Switching gears, in our jobs, we also cover, as journalists, some heavy topics.
Oh,
We
yeah.
can talk about tragedies. We talk about people going through the worst days in their entire lives. We cover mass shootings. We cover these really, really tough topics. Some people are in war zones covering these hard topics. And that can be so stressful in itself.
Yes.
My question is, how do you stay empathetic while telling these stories, while also protecting our own heart?
Yeah. Yeah. People who aren't in this industry, research out of Harvard shows that just listening to the news for 3 minutes in the morning increases your chance of having a bad day by 27%.
Wow.
What you all do is constantly being inundated by this. So, a couple of things. Again, I told you I was going to come back to this. Do what you can to make sure you are out of the red zone as much as possible. Learn the ways, and I don't do this as much, obviously, as what you do, but in terms of a lot of my training was in psycho-oncology. So I worked on a bone marrow transplant unit where every day I would come in and see who was still alive because they were so sick. And oftentimes we'd have one or even two deaths a week. So I get it on a different level. It's very much taking care of yourself, going in and being empathetic and being loving, but also learning how to turn it off or decrease it and be very present to where you are when you leave work, with your family, with your friends, with yourself. And again, looking at what do you need to be that best version of yourself.
I honestly stopped looking at my phone first thing in the morning, and I might not know exactly what's happening first thing, but I'm going to be covering it all day at work. So I made that a priority to have my mornings free of the noise, having my phone to the side. And then once I clock out of work, granted, there's always breaking news, but for the most part, the phone goes away too, because I just need to protect that otherwise. And especially in our day and age when a lot of us are even remote positions, it feels like your phone, your work computer, everything is right there in front of you all day, every day. And that can just be your whole day, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And setting those boundaries is really important. I just want to go back to what you said about the first thing in the morning. When we go from awake to asleep and asleep to awake, our brain waves are in the same place as when someone who's in hypnosis. Hypnosis, by the way, is not perhaps how it's portrayed in the movies. Hypnosis is just a state of suggestibility. So what we put in our minds first thing when we wake up and right before we go to sleep is absolute paramount. So what are you putting in your mind? Are you waking up and looking at the phone or thinking, how bad is this day going to be? Or are you setting an intention? Are you starting with even just 30 seconds of gratitude? Those little things can really make a big difference.
1000%. I try to start my day with the gratitude because I think it does set you up for it sets you up for a better day. It really does.
Yeah. And what you're doing is you're actually priming your brain. Our subconscious is like a sponge, right? You think about it, you have a sponge, you put it in water, what does it do? It absorbs the water, right? You wring it out and put it in milk, what does it do? It absorbs the milk. It doesn't once say, I don't do dairy. Our subconscious is like that too, particularly we're going from awake to asleep and asleep to awake. It's absorbing everything. So fuel it with what you want in your mind. If gratitude sounds too much, sometimes I sleep with my four-legged son. He's on my bed, and sometimes I'll just, spend like the first minute of my awake time just petting him and hanging out with him. That's the kind of thing that it's those little things that can make a really big difference.
Are there any tips that you could give our listeners that are performers, that are journalists, that are in front of the camera? Any tips you could give them when they are facing these on-air positions?
Yeah, so in the moment, it's that posture. Again, it may sound silly, but it sends a message to our subconscious, everything's good. Filling your brain with positivity when you can. I'm not talking Pollyanna, life's perfect, but what are you saying to yourself? What's that conversation you're saying to yourself? And I like to call it BFA, best friend advice. So if you could stick a microphone in your brain, if you're hearing things like, oh, totally messed up, what's wrong with me? I'm a failure, I'm never going to amount to anything. That conversation, is that something that if your best friend came to you, you would say, you are a failure. And let me remind you of 5 other times you totally messed up. We would never do that, right? And so start to have a conversation with yourself as you would someone that you care about, because I hope that you do care about yourself. But that internal dialogue, what we think impacts how we feel and how we function. I work with a lot of athletes. I do sports psychology, peak performance psychology, and we are looking at what that conversation is in their mind. Because if you were literally drowning, if I'm working with a basketball player and they are having trouble with free throws because they're in the red zone, how well could someone do free throws if they were drowning? Couldn't do it, right? And so we need to get out of that red zone. We need to have a different dialogue in your mind and really priming your brain for things that serve you. I say accurate and helpful. That's what we want this conversation to be in our minds.
For somebody that is listening right now that just feels stuck in their career, what would you say to them?
I would say look at what is working for you and what's not. Because a lot of times we say, it's not working. But what is it? What do you like about it and what do you not like about it? And take a step back and try to be objective. Sometimes that's hard to identify. And so actually spending time writing it down, we have 60,000 thoughts racing through our head. When we take it from our head and put it down on paper, it allows us to process it differently. There's all kinds of research. It's called written emotional disclosure, but it's basically diary, writing in a diary. Just writing it out, that will start to give you some clarity. And then again, look at what's working for you and what's not. Sometimes the what's not you can address. Sometimes you realize, what's not working is this person I'm working with, and then you need to address that. But really look at what are the ingredients, because it's probably not the whole cake. It's probably 1 or 2 ingredients that aren't working for you. And then you can address those ingredients.
Dr. E, I could ask you 1,000 more questions, but can you quickly just tell me about your book, In the Red Zone, and also where people can find you?
Sure, yeah. So it's get out of the red zone because everyone's already in the red zone. You can find me at elizabethlombardo.com or I'm on Instagram, DRE Lombardo.
And what can people expect when they read your book?
Yeah, so the book is it's very thin. I can show you. So don't worry, it's not one of my thicker ones. It's very thin, very easy. It's actionable steps. So you read something and then here is what you do. It's taking all the complexity of the research that we know and presenting in what I call bite-sized digestible morsels so that you can actually use it. It's not theory, it's very practical of things that you can do. And one of the things I love about this is I'll give a keynote and hear from someone years later and they will say, we are still talking about the red zone. We're still helping each other, by the way, helping each other get out of the red zone. They're having conversations at home about it too. So these are skills that we all would benefit from because when we're in that red zone, we cannot be the people who we want to be.
Thank you so much for talking with me. I know this is going to be so helpful for journalists and just women in general in our industry. Is there anything else you would like to say to our listeners before I let you go?
Yeah, wherever you are, and even if it feels like there's nothing you can do, there's always one step you can take. If the goal is to get to the top of the Empire State Building, you don't do that in one swoop. And I think particularly women in this industry are very purpose driven. They're so passionate and work so hard. And when you work hard, you want to see those results. I would say just take a deep breath and allow yourself to take one step further, one step higher, because you keep taking those little steps and you do get to where you want to go.